This banana can hire the CIA to assassinate a democracy for a few cents in profit. It's not a snack. It's a murder weapon with 100-year body count. Welcome to the Yellow Empire.
Philadelphia, 1876. A city drowning in the roar of the future. The air is thick with coal smoke and the frantic energy of the Centennial Exposition. Inside the grand halls, the Victorian elite glide past towering steam engines and glowing light bulbs, searching for the next miracle. And there, tucked away in a corner, sits an object of pure, tinfoil-wrapped desire. It was a fruit, but to the people of Philadelphia, it might as well have been a diamond from Mars. They called it the Gros Michel, the Big Mike. It was creamy, it was decadent, and at 10 cents a slice, it cost as much as a laborer's meal. To eat it was to participate in a ritual of the highborn. You didn't bite it, you sliced it with silver, tasting the sweetness of a tropical world that felt 1,000 years away. But while the wealthy savored that buttery gold, a 23-year-old from Brooklyn named Minor Keith was learning that the source of this sweetness was a place where life was the cheapest commodity of all. Minor Keith hadn't come to the Costa Rican jungle to find fruit. He had come to build a monument to progress a railroad. His uncle, Henry Meigs, was a man who moved mountains and broke nations to lay tracks. And Minor was his soldier. The plan was simple: connect the highlands of San Jose to the Caribbean coast. But the jungle didn't care about plans. The jungle was a wall of pulsing green hunger. For every mile of track Keith's men laid, the jungle demanded a tribute in human bone. The air was a thick, humid soup of yellow fever and malaria. Thousands of men, Italians, Chinese, Jamaicans, and desperate souls from the New York Bowery marched into the trees and never marched out. In just the first 25 miles, 5,000 men were buried in the mud. Keith watched his own 3 brothers wither and die under the tropical sun, their skin turning yellow as the fever claimed them. By the early 1880s, the dream was dead. The Costa Rican government was bankrupt. The railroad was a skeleton rusting in the rain. Minor Keith was a man standing in a graveyard, clutching a pile of debt that should have crushed his spirit. But in the midst of this catastrophe, he noticed something peculiar about the food he had planted to keep his dying workers from starving. He had planted bananas, the same Gros Michel that the New York elite were eating with silver forks. In the volcanic soil of Costa Rica, they didn't just grow, they exploded. They were fast, they were resilient, and they were incredibly calorie-dense. When Keith ran a few trial shipments of these bananas back to the United States on his supply ships, he didn't just find a market. He found an obsession. The realization hit him like a lightning strike. The railroad was a failure, but the land, the vast, tax-free millions of acres he had negotiated from a desperate government, was a gold mine that grew on trees. He pivoted from a man of steel to a man of fruit. He began clearing the rainforest, not for tracks, but for an endless, emerald ocean of identical trees. This was the birth of the monoculture. Keith didn't want a variety of fruits. He wanted a standardized, predictable product that could survive a weeks-long journey across the ocean. He wanted the Gros Michel to be the perfect soldier of the American breakfast table, and in doing so, he traded the diversity of nature for the cold efficiency of the assembly line. By the time the century turned, Keith had merged his empire to form the United Fruit Company. It was an entity so massive, so hungry for land and power, that the people of Central America gave it a terrifying name: El Pulpo, the octopus, a creature whose tentacles reached into every post office, every telegraph line, and every presidential palace. But as the octopus grew, it was about to encounter a rival who didn't care about silver forks or Victorian manners. A man who understood that if you wanted to rule the banana world, you didn't just need land. You needed a private army. By the dawn of the 20th century, the map of Central America had begun to lie. If you looked at an official map, you would see sovereign nations, Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, with their own borders, their own laws, and their own presidents. But there was another map, an invisible one, etched in steel and steam. On this map, there were no citizens, only consumers and laborers. There were no cities, only ports and loading docks. This was the map of the United Fruit Company, and in their world, the banana was the only law that mattered. They called the company El Pulpo, the octopus. It was a nickname born of a cold, creeping reality. Minor Keith's empire didn't just grow bananas. It owned the very nervous system of the countries it occupied. If you wanted to send a telegram to a dying relative, you used the company's wires. If you wanted to mail a letter, you used the company's post. If you wanted to travel from the coast to the capital, you sat on a company train, moving over company land, fueled by company coal. The nations of Central America had become husks, their infrastructure built not to serve their own people, but to ensure that a green fruit reached a New York dock before it turned yellow. But every empire, no matter how vast, eventually faces a disruptor. And for the octopus, that disruptor was a man who started with nothing but a pile of garbage. Imagine the docks of New Orleans in the 1890s. The air is thick with the smell of salt, rotting fish, and the heavy, sweet scent of ripening fruit. Among the chaos of the wharf stood Samuel Zemere, a young Russian immigrant with a tall frame and a gaze that could cut through steel. At the time, the big fruit companies had a rule. If a banana had even a single brown spot, it was garbage. It was too ripe to survive the long train ride to the north. They threw these ripeners away by the ton. Zemere saw not trash, but a gold mine. He bought the bruised fruit for pennies, rented a fast boxcar, and sold them at lightning speed along the tracks before they could rot. He was a man of the dirt, a man who spoke the language of the docks, and he was getting rich off the scraps of the giants. But Sam, the banana man, didn't want scraps. He wanted his own kingdom. He turned his sights toward Honduras. At the time, Honduras was the quintessential banana republic, a term coined by the writer O.B.S.C.Z. Henry to describe a nation where the government was merely a service provider for fruit exporters. But Honduras was also in debt, drowning in loans to British banks. The United States government, wanting to keep European influence out of the hemisphere, stepped in with a plan. They would allow American banks to take over the Honduran debt, and in exchange, the U.S. would collect the country's customs duties. To Sam Zemere, this was a death sentence. If the U.S. government controlled the customs house, Sam couldn't get the tax breaks he needed to compete with the octopus. He went to Washington, D.C. to plead his case to Secretary of State Philander Knox. He was laughed out of the room. The giants told him to stay in his place. They forgot one thing. Sam Zemere didn't play by the rules of gentlemen in suits. He played by the rules of the jungle. Sam returned to New Orleans and did something unthinkable. He didn't hire a lawyer. He hired a mercenary. Not just any mercenary, but Lee Christmas, a legendary, hard-drinking, one-eyed railroad engineer who had a habit of starting revolutions for fun. Sam bought a surplus high-speed yacht called the Hornet, packed it with guns, ammunition, and a handful of the most dangerous men in the Caribbean, and slipped out of the harbor under the cover of night, evading the federal agents sent to stop him. In 1911, Sam Zemere invaded a country to save his profit margins. The Hornet landed on the coast of Honduras, and with Lee Christmas leading the charge, they began a lightning campaign. They didn't need a massive army. They just needed to be faster and bolder than the aging government. Within weeks, they had captured the key ports. The president of Honduras fled, and Sam's hand-picked replacement, Manuel Bonilla, was swept into power. The reward for Sam's investment was immediate. The new government granted Zemere massive tracts of land and, most importantly, a permanent tax exemption, while the United Fruit Company operated with the cold bureaucracy of a colonial state. Sam Zemere operated like a pirate king. This was the true birth of the Banana Republic. It wasn't just a place where fruit was grown. It was a place where the concept of the nation-state had been murdered by the ledger book. It was a world where a private citizen could overthrow a government over a tax dispute. But as the octopus and the banana man fought for dominance, they were both ignoring a silent, microscopic witness to their greed. Deep in the soil of the plantations, something was stirring. The Gros Michel, the perfect, standardized fruit that had built these empires, was about to meet an enemy that couldn't be bribed, shot, or overthrown. A shadow was falling over the emerald leaves, and soon, the smell of empire would turn from the scent of ripening fruit to the stench of rot. By the late 1920s, the United Fruit Company was no longer just a business. It was a ghost that haunted the lives of nearly every person in the Caribbean basin. But there was a growing friction in the machinery of the empire. The bananas were still flowing, the ships were still sailing, but the men who swung the machetes were starting to ask a dangerous question. Are we human beings, or are we just another piece of equipment? In the Santa Marta region of Colombia, the tension reached a breaking point. Thousands of workers on the company's vast plantations lived in conditions that would make a medieval serf recoil. They were paid in company scrip fake money that could only be spent at company stores for overpriced goods. They had no hospitals. They had no toilets. They slept in shacks that were more like ovens than homes. But when the workers finally organized and presented a list of demands, the United Fruit Company did something brilliant and terrifying. They looked at the request for basic sanitation and fair pay, and they didn't see a labor dispute. They saw a red menace. You see, this was the era of the first Red Scare. The company's executives realized that if they admitted they were mistreating workers, they would look like villains. But if they claimed they were fighting a secret Soviet conspiracy to take over the Western Hemisphere, they would look like heroes. The company refused to negotiate. Their reasoning was a masterpiece of corporate legalism. They claimed they didn't actually have any employees. Since the workers were hired through third-party contractors, the United Fruit Company technically had no legal relationship with the men who died in their fields. It was the birth of the gig economy loophole, 100 years before the first smartphone app. In December 1928, the strike paralyzed the region. The fruit was rotting on the trees. To the octopus, a rotting banana was a greater sin than a broken life. They pressured the Colombian government, hinting that if the strike wasn't settled, the United States Marine Corps might just have to intervene to protect American property. Terrified of a U.S. invasion, the Colombian government sent in the army. On a Sunday morning in the town of Ciénaga, thousands of strikers and their families gathered in the town square after church. They believed they were safe. They believed the soldiers were there to protect them. Instead, General Cortés Vargas took the stage and read a decree. The strikers were hoodlums and enemies of the state. He gave them 5 minutes to disperse. The crowd stayed. They had nowhere else to go. A boy stood on his father's shoulders. A mother clutched her infant. Then, the machine guns opened fire. The exact number of the dead has been scrubbed from the official records of history. Some say 40, others say 3,000. What we do know is that the bodies were loaded onto the company's own fruit trains and dumped into the sea, becoming fish food for the very coast they had tried to build. But the most chilling part of the story didn't happen in the town square of Ciénaga. It happened in an office in New York City. Enter Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and a man who understood the human mind better than almost anyone alive. Bernays was a magician of the frame. He believed that the masses were a herd that needed to be led by an invisible government. The United Fruit Company hired him to make the blood on the peel disappear. Bernays didn't try to deny the massacre. Instead, he changed the conversation. He flooded American newspapers with stories about the communist threat in Central America. He created fake news bureaus that sent unbiased reports to congressmen. He turned a story about corporate greed and mass murder into a story about American patriotism and national security. Under Bernays' touch, the truth became a mirage. If you complained about the octopus, you weren't a reformer. You were a traitor. If you wanted a hospital for your children, you were a Bolshevik. He taught the world that it doesn't matter what happened. It only matters what people believe happened. This was the frame war. And as Bernays' propaganda took root in the American mind, it set the stage for something even more ambitious. Because the octopus had learned a very valuable lesson. If a government gets in the way of your profit, you don't just hire a mercenary like Sam, the Banana Man. You hire the CIA. The tragedy in Colombia was just a rehearsal. The real performance was about to begin in the mountains of Guatemala, where a young president was about to learn that in the world of the banana, democracy is a luxury that the company simply cannot afford.
By the early 1950s, the United Fruit Company was no longer just a business. It was an aging god. And like all aging gods, it was terrified of change. That change had a name, Jacobo Arbenz. Imagine a man who believed in the American dream so much that he wanted to bring it to Guatemala. Arbenz wasn't a wild-eyed radical or a Soviet puppet. He was a soldier and a Democrat who looked at his country and saw a feudal estate owned by a foreign corporation. In Guatemala, the United Fruit Company owned the only port, the only railroad, and over 70% of the arable land. Yet, they only cultivated about 15% of it. The rest sat idle, held in a chokehold to keep competitors out, while Guatemalan children starved on the edges of emerald green fields. In 1952, Arbenz passed Decree 900. It was a land reform act that sounded remarkably like the Homestead Act that had built the American West. The government would buy the uncultivated land from the big landlords and redistribute it to 500,000 landless peasants. But there was a catch, a poetic, devastating catch. For years, the United Fruit Company had lied on its tax returns, vastly undervaluing its land to avoid paying taxes to the Guatemalan government. When Arbenz offered to buy the land, he offered exactly what the company had claimed it was worth on their tax forms. The octopus had been caught in its own trap. They wanted $16 million. Arbenz offered them $600,000. This was the moment the frame war we discussed in Colombia evolved into a full-scale covert invasion. The company didn't just call their lawyers. They called their friends in the highest reaches of the American government, and those friends were everywhere. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother, CIA Director Alan Dulles, were both former partners at the law firm that represented the United Fruit Company. To them, an attack on the company's profits was an attack on the United States itself. Edward Bernays, the master of propaganda, went back to work. He didn't talk about land taxes or corporate profits. He spoke of the Soviet beachhead in the Americas. He flew influential American journalists to Guatemala on all expenses, paid trips, making sure they only saw what he wanted them to see. He painted Arbenz as a red menace, a puppet of Moscow lurking in Washington's backyard. Then came Operation PB Success. This was the CIA's first major coup in Latin America, and it was a masterpiece of psychological horror. They didn't need a massive army. They needed a massive lie. The CIA set up a clandestine radio station called the Voice of Liberation. They broadcasted fake reports of massive rebel armies marching on the Capitol. They used sound effects of non-existent battles and played recordings of defecting pilots. They jammed the government's own radio frequencies, creating a vacuum of information that they filled with terror. American pilots, hired by the CIA, flew over Guatemala City, dropping not just bombs, but leaflets that screamed of an imminent Soviet takeover. This is the modern insight we must not ignore. The 1954 coup was the birth of the deepfake era. Long before AI algorithms, the CIA and the United Fruit Company realized that you don't have to win a war on the ground if you can win it in the minds of the people. They created an echo chamber where the truth was drowned out by the roar of manufactured fear. Arbenz, isolated and convinced that his own army had turned against him, resigned to prevent a bloodbath. He was forced to leave the country, stripped to his underwear at the airport to humiliate him before the cameras. The man who wanted to build a middle class in Guatemala was replaced by a military dictator who immediately returned the land to the United Fruit Company and abolished labor unions. The cost of a cheap banana was now 40 years of civil war, hundreds of thousands of disappeared citizens, and a scar on Latin American history that has never fully healed. But as the company celebrated its victory over democracy, it failed to notice a much smaller, much more persistent enemy. While the CIA was busy overthrowing presidents, a silent killer was moving through the soil of the plantations. It was a fungus, a microscopic traveler that didn't care about propaganda or Cold War politics. The Gros Michel, the fruit that had built this empire, was dying. And as the world was about to find out, when you build an empire on a single, identical clone, you aren't just building a business, you're building a biological house of cards. For decades, the United Fruit Company had acted as if it owned the laws of physics and the hearts of men. They had survived strikes, outmaneuvered competitors, and toppled presidents with the help of the CIA. But as the 1950s drew to a close, the octopus found itself fighting an enemy it couldn't intimidate with a gun or silence with a press release. It was a silent, microscopic traveler called Fusarium oxysporum, known to the world as the Panama disease. To understand the horror of the Panama disease, you have to understand the Gros Michel itself. The Big Mike was more than just a fruit. It was a miracle of logistics. Every single Gros Michel banana in the world was a genetic clone of every other Gros Michel. Because they were seedless, they didn't reproduce through the messy, unpredictable lottery of sex. They were grown from suckers cuttings from a mother plant. This meant that if you bought a banana in London and another in San Francisco, you were eating the exact same organism. This genetic sameness was the secret to the company's wealth. It allowed for a global assembly line where every shipping crate, every ripening room, and every grocery shelf could be built to a single, perfect specification. But in nature, sameness is a suicide pact. The Panama disease was a soil-borne fungus that attacked the plant's vascular system. It didn't just eat the fruit. It choked the plant from the inside out, preventing it from drinking water. A plantation could look lush and green on Monday, and by Friday, it would be a graveyard of yellowing, collapsing stalks. And because every plant was a clone, none of them had the biological memory or the mutation needed to fight back. If one plant was vulnerable, they were all vulnerable. The fungus traveled in the most mundane ways, clinging to the mud on a worker's boot, hitching a ride on the wheels of a fruit train, or flowing through the irrigation ditches the company had built to increase efficiency. The very infrastructure Miner Keith had built to conquer the jungle was now the highway for the jungle's revenge. By the early 1960s, the unthinkable happened. The Gros Michel, the fruit that had built empires and sparked wars, was effectively extinct in the commercial market. The scent of the Central American coast changed from the sweet, wine-like aroma of ripening gold to the putrid stench of rotting empires. The United Fruit Company, once the most powerful entity in the hemisphere, was hemorrhaging money. Their perfect soldier had fallen, and they had no backup plan. In a desperate scramble to save their profits, the industry turned to a variety they had previously ignored: the Cavendish. To the banana barons of the 1950s, the Cavendish was a disappointment. It was smaller, it tasted less intense, and its skin was so thin it bruised if you even looked at it wrong. But it had one superpower: it was immune to the Panama disease. The transition was a monumental feat of engineering. The entire global supply chain, the ships, the crates, the ripening warehouses had to be ripped up and rebuilt for this delicate new fruit. We saved the banana, but we lost the soul of it. The Cavendish we eat today is the bland survivor, a ghost of the rich, creamy fruit our great-grandparents enjoyed. But here's the most haunting part of the story: the modern warning that we still refuse to hear. We didn't learn the lesson of the Gros Michel. Instead of embracing diversity, we doubled down on the monoculture. Today, 99% of the bananas exported to the West are Cavendish. And right now, as you read this, a new strain of the fungus TR4 is sweeping through plantations in Asia, Africa, and South America. It has finally learned how to kill the Cavendish. History isn't just repeating itself, it's accelerating. This is the butterfly effect of Minor Keith's 1871 decision. A simple choice to plant a cheap, efficient crop to feed railroad workers eventually led to a world where our food systems, our economies, and even our digital lives are built on the fragile beauty of the clone. Think about your social media feed, your news sources, your algorithmic echo chambers. We have built a digital monoculture where we only consume the information that looks like us, thinks like us, and agrees with us. It feels efficient. It feels comfortable. But just like the Gros Michel, a system without diversity is a system waiting for a plague. The story of the banana is a reminder that efficiency is not the same as resilience. The octopus thought it could control the world by making everything the same. It forgot that the world's true strength lies in its messiness, its variety, and its unpredictability. The next time you peel a banana, look at that yellow fruit and remember the empires it built, the presidents it overthrew, and the silent, fungal ghost of the Big Mike that still haunts the soil of the jungle. It is a warning wrapped in appeal. If we don't learn to value diversity over the bottom line, we are all just clones waiting for our own Panama disease.